when I do project management, courses, we do this thing where I give you roles and I name them all like, warrior, mage, things like that, and it's all based on the mage is the programmer, the warrior is the artist, and things like that. So I always make the musician or the sound person the summoner, because they're the ones that summon the emotions into the process.
Excellent.
Yes.
What school?
What?
What school?
American University. Yep.
All right, I think, are we ready to start now?
Yes. All right. So, welcome to Is Game Art Art? So I'm Chris Totten. I am the game artist in residence at American University. I have written a couple things on games and game development, like architectural approach to level design. Buy my book. Shameless plugging. And game character creation with Blender and Unity. I'm the chair of the International Game Developers Association here in Washington, D.C., and I have my own indie studio. I make games, basically, and I write stuff about games. So, I'm going to try to get through this really quickly. I have a lot of slides, but I'm going to go through them very fast. So I have a confession to make. As the person who came up with the title of this, to me the question of whether game art is kind of tough. It depends on what your definition of art is. So if we go back 5 years to people arguing about whether games themselves are art, it became kind of difficult to parse that out, because people didn't really know there's no good definition of art itself. So now that I've attracted you to this room, I can say, this isn't about, is it art? Because we're just going to say it is. Because, what is art? So what it's going to be about is, so we're going to assume it is art, but what kind of art is it? And where is it in the world of art? And where does it sit? And do we do particularly good art? Do people who do game art think about it as art? So I'm going to look at, I'm a historical scholar. I'm a history nerd. And if I've written enough about it, that makes me a scholar. So in art history, there's this notion of genre. So today we think of genres mainly in literary or film contexts, as they relate to the type of information being transmitted or the type of story being told. So film genre, literary film context. So you have documentary films, superhero films, romantic comedies, cartoons, things like that. In games, we look at game genres as the type of mechanic in play. So is something 2D, 3D, or how it's, what its format is, 2D, 3D, first person, platformer, adventure, role-playing, etc. So we call those genres. But between the 17th and 19th century, in the academic art period in France, art was categorized into the genre system, into a hierarchy of what were called genres. So they weren't separated by style. In fact, a lot of people actually painted with a very similar photorealistic style, but the topic of the painting, so, history painting, religious, historic, allegorical, portraits, they kind of speak for themselves. Genre is scenes of everyday life. And these were organized by the different, the type of materials you could use, and prominently the size of the media you would render, or the size of the canvas you would render them on. So if we look at history painting in particular, these were paintings for which you could use a monumental canvas sizes, and we're talking about, go to the art museum and see that painting that takes up the whole wall. That's a history painting. You were allowed to have nudes in them. They had non-static topics. So, they would be scenes of action, like the last day of Pompeii here. And then you can, if you did history paintings, or if you did paintings in general, you would have to go to the academy, and that's where you could show off your paintings to be a real artist. So, Gustave Courbet, I'm terrible with non-American words, I apologize. challenged this tradition by painting the funeral of his commoner uncle, which was normally a genre painting. But he painted this at 24 feet by 10 feet. And it's indicative of what became known as the realism movement, which was, doing these massive paintings of just everyday stuff. So then this, challenge spun off really quickly, and you get a timeline of art movement. So if we're, if you see kind of academic art in the middle of the first third there, then, look at how closely bunched the dots are. Those are centuries, and so that means there are relatively few art movements during those centuries, and then after the 19th century, look what happens. Suddenly we start getting tons and tons of art movements, and each of those are doing increasingly wacky and wild stuff with the way stuff looks. So what does this have to do with video games? In modern popular games, we see things like this, where they use exhilaration as a method of selling the game, eye candy. Who here has ever bought a book of concept art from a game? Who here has ever bought Blizzard's books of concept art from their games? Okay. Oh, actually surprisingly few. Well, those Blizzard is especially good at this. They're like history paintings. They show these big epic events, and that's the content of the work. As somebody who actually has painted concept art, I can tell you that, like those history paintings, you're also painting them at very high resolutions, usually in the thousands of pixels by more thousands of pixels. So unlike history paintings, these pieces of art can vary in topic based on the production needs of a game. They'll show epic scenes like this thing, but also like The Last Day of Pompeii, which we looked at. Others conceptualize landscapes or close-up of characters, again, depending on what needs are in production. They'll be painted at very high resolutions to photorealistic standards, and then reinterpreted in games to best utilize the power of the console or computer that it's being displayed on. But again, they're a marketing thing to sort of be like, look how awesome and badass our game is. And then one can even argue that the AAA studio is sort of the academy. It's the place where you go and it's like, well, that's where you're a real game maker. So that's where you go to get into games. There's this, what many feel is a closed-off system into the industry. But by observing these trends in popular genres, we can find parallels in the history of art and theorize where games may or can go next visually, and also find opportunities for people like me, you, your friends, your enemies, your future children, whoever, to get into games. So let's start here. Okay, we're looking at the history painting there. So we're trying to see. We're trying to look at, so let's say that's where we've placed game art. But wait a minute. I know what you're thinking. What about pixel art, Chris? Well, what about him? In Digital Games Research Association conference paper by scholar Jesper Juul, entitled High-Tech, Low-Tech Authenticity, Juul explores the art history of winning games at the Independent Games Festival, which is called, the IGF. So he argues that by observing the transition from AAA-like 3D graphics, so if you see 2000, 3D, isometric, 3D, 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 and then you start, there's some 3D still, then there's like a hand-drawn period, and then suddenly it goes all pixel style, okay? So he makes the observation that, by trying to recreate the aesthetic of the pixel style, it's almost like going back to the origins of video games, and thus, it's kind of like people in the arts and crafts movement going back to the origins of art and printing and design techniques. So pixel art has other advantages. Not only can it be beautiful, you can also do it in a very short amount of time. Here's some Global Game Jam art I made last year. A lot of people downstairs in the Global Game Jam are doing pixel art right now. It has a much lower barrier of entry, who are not the artistic type, so a lot of non-artists do pixel art, and their games look pretty good. So the downsides of pixel art, of course, are that it's everywhere now. And not that much different from how games looked decades ago. And again, that's Yule's point, but maybe it could be good, could be bad. We don't know. It depends on your opinion. So if we do argue that we're stuck in these things, so we're kind of stuck in pixel art, and we're stuck in photorealism, and we're stuck in 3D, that's supposed to be a question mark, by the way. What's next? How do we get there? So an important engine for experimentations in art, like what we saw in the late 19th and 20th centuries, is places like Le Chat Noir, which is much more than a popular poster in college dorm rooms for people that want to look sophisticated. It was a nightclub and a meeting place for like Toulouse-Lautrec and others in the Art Nouveau movement. Online indie communities and local dev meetups work very similarly. You can share your work and start to create like cool trends by being like, wow, that guy did something cool, I want to go try it too. And then suddenly you might become a movement. So some examples of things to inspire you as artists. There are observable trends that point to digitizing real-world art as a method for creating art for indie games. So Squinky Kai's Dominic Pamplemousse made waves at the IGF last year with its art, which was all clay and craft materials. So you see, they created a deteriorating office by taking corrugated cardboard, putting wallpaper on the surface of it, and then tearing off the one layer of the cardboard to look like the inside of the wall. That's brilliant. You could do that and then take a picture of it and make a game out of that. Designer and comic scholar Daniel Merlin Goodbray is exploring intersections between comics and gaming called hypercomic games, which utilize the mechanics of comic strips. I, again, being a developer myself, am looking to see how methods can work in production pipelines. So actually say, that's cool, how long does it take? How effective is it? So what kind of novelty do they generate? I made a game last year called Zup, which is now available on iOS and Android. I used craft foam cutouts, because somebody said, make it look like South Park. So I'm like, I'll really make it look like South Park. And a little bit of adventure time. So I did an entire game's worth of character, environment, and UI art in under a week. Fastest art I've ever done. And it looks like complete. Probably one of the most complete looking games I've ever done too. I'm undertaking a project called Atelier Games, named after the method of learning art by studying under renowned masters. The first in this series is a single and multiplayer action game that explores mechanics and themes in the work of Russian suprematist El Lissiski, and utilizes the game mechanics of Yar's Revenge. I call it Lissiski's Revenge. And I made it all out of paper cutouts. And again, very fast art. I'm also going to explore the art styles of René Magritte, Clyde Singer, Ludislav Sutnar, and some others to see, how does oil painting work? How does watercolor work? How does infographic work? So those are some things that might be coming up. And then if we see parallels between established techniques and certain periods of art history, we can find opportunities not only to explore next steps, but also include more people in game making. With our modern ability to digitize easily created real-world art, we can open the doors to new artists, like, at the time, 5-year-old Cassie Crichton, who's the game artist and writer for the world-renowned Sissy's Magical Ponycorn Adventure, for which her and her father gave a TED Talk. It's the cutest game you've ever played. If you've never played it, you will instantly become a fan person of it. So yeah, it opens new opportunities for people to join the game-making fold. And that's it. That's my little spiel. Go to those things.
Thanks, Chris. Hi. Let's see. I'm a little microphone challenged, which is funny since I'm an audio person. But I'm a drummer, so maybe that explains it. Not a singer. But my name is Chanel Summers, and just to give you a little bit of a quick background on myself, I've been in the video game industry for about 20 years. I hate to admit that. Sometimes I say, oh, but I started when I was 5. But I've been in the game industry for about 20 years and focusing primarily in the area of interactive audio for digital media. However, I did start off as a game designer and game producer in a lot of early innovating companies such as Mindscape and Velocity. If you've ever played Spectre VR, that was like the first, network massively multiplayer game. And then also Mattel Media. And then ended up at a little company called Microsoft, where I helped ship their it's very tiny small company. There's very few people in it.
It's underground.
It's underground. And I helped ship their first ever massively multiplayer game called Fighter Ace. Then I moved into the Windows and DirectX side of the house and started working on the DirectX audio technologies, where we started experimenting with interactive audio. And we had developed a technology called Direct Music that allowed you to create adaptive and dynamic and interactive audio for games. Games are nonlinear, audio should be nonlinear. Sounds simple. Not that simple. Then I moved on to the original Xbox team, where I helped to develop the audio subsystem for that groundbreaking console, and then went on to create the first ever support team for content creators. There'd always been support teams for the technical folks, for the programmers, but never for the creative folks, the sound designers, the composers, the game artists, the game designers. And with the Xbox, we really wanted to usher in the next generation of gaming, and so we knew we had to make the creative people very successful. And then after I left Microsoft, I went and pursued more direct applications of audio. First as a recording and touring drummer, and then also creating my own audio production and consulting house, Syndicate 17. I also lecture on the art and aesthetics of creating artistic audio for video games at the University of Southern California, as well as other prestigious universities around the world. And in fact, as I think I may have talked about, I'm going to give a talk at 4:30 where I really dive deeply into the aesthetics of game audio design. But right now, I'm going to just talk a little bit about it and kind of give you a glimpse into a few things. But if you join me at 4:30, I'll really get into some cool depth. So one thing I want to do, actually I want to demo quickly just because, Chris, you brought up the whole thing of making art fast and kind of unusual ways and creative ways of making art. Well, so in my class at USC and also at workshops I run, we look at unusual ways to interact and work with sound. Because actually a lot of my students that I work with don't have audio backgrounds, don't have composition backgrounds. They come from all sorts of different types of backgrounds. I have game designers, I have business administration majors, I have psychology majors, I have immersive architects, and so forth. So, the whole thing is to be very experimental. So one of the labs we run is the cardboard lab. And with the cardboard lab, essentially, you get to either make a musical composition with the sounds of cardboard, or create an entire soundscape with the sounds of cardboard that you can use in your game or a film or whatever medium you're working in. So I want to just play really quickly just a couple of short excerpts of students who choose to create musical compositions with cardboard. Give me 1 second.
Do you need the...
No, because I'm just going to play right now. Sorry, everybody. It's not open yet.
We have an issue.
No, it's loading VLC.
And no, we don't have sound.
Now we're having issues.
lines haven't gotten a rave scene going.
I was gonna say, sound people are magic.
These people have no audio backgrounds. These are game design students.
People educated by good sound people are magic.
Check this one out. Musical piano tones. Scoreboard. So that just gives you a really quick example of, so again, these students had no musical, no audio backgrounds. These were game design students. We were just working, being very experimental with like materials and, how we could process out, the cardboard and kind of mangle it into the way we want to. And both these pieces were created in less than a week. And so these are interesting, unusual ways that they could create musical forms for whatever medium they chose to work in. Now, the other thing I want to actually show quickly, and I'm going to delve into the details of this at my 4:30 talk, is I've been working with famous production designer Alex McDowell, who's known for such interesting cinematic classics as Fight Club and Minority Report, the whole screen gestural system. He came up with that. Man of Steel, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, many others. Well, in conjunction with him, USC, and Intel Labs, we've started really investigating about, storytelling. That storytelling is an important part of all of our lives, an important component of all of our lives. And so this next demo is really kind of showing like, another form of art, augmented reality. Basically taking something from the pages of a book, lifting it up, interpreting it in its immersive interactive form. So what we did is for the subject of the demo, we took Scott Westerfeld's novels, the Leviathan novels, if any of you are familiar with those. They're based on a very rich steampunk world, where it kind of reimagines World War I with mechanized combat and sort of whale ships and these octopus-like type creatures, and it's a pretty cool universe. And so we sort of examined how we could take that world from the pages of a book and create this, augmented reality world that the audience members could physically engage with, explore, and interact with, and sort of, you can create more space for story. So let me just actually kind of bring the whale out to you here. Moby Dick, and where now the students can do something really cool and actually interact and engage with the whale instead of being passive learners. But, so art is like extending to all sorts of different areas. And the other remark I'm just going to make before I hand it over to Jeremy, that, you know, one of the things that we're struggling with in the game audio world is game audio has really kind of evolved over the past like 10 to 15 years, but a lot because of technology. And we have all sorts of amazing devices. We have like interactive and dynamic audio, we have procedural audio, you know, we have real-time effects processing, we have 3D audio, binaural audio, you know, game sound is now the same fidelity as film sound, but the problem is, game audio now is technically well executed as a feature film, but we're not always using these fantastic tools to create art, and that's an issue. We're becoming so overwhelmed by the technology that we're losing sight of what the art is. So a lot of game audio is, yeah, it's very high fidelity, amazing sound effects, amazing orchestral scores that have been like, you know, recorded from large live orchestras. But it's not necessarily art. And so we need to start, you know, thinking about concepts like less is more, maybe imposing limitations on ourselves, kind of like, you know, the developers of yesteryear, like who did Atari and NES and SNES games, where they didn't have the technology, they didn't have the hardware, so they had to be creative and they had to be artistic. We need to impose some of those limitations on ourselves so we can think about how to return to making artistic audio. But I'll talk more about this at 4:30. Thanks, and I will hand it over to Jeremy.
All right. All right. So, for those who don't know me, my name is Jeremy Pesner. I'm the Assistant Director for Mages, and I've been doing the MAGFest Mages circuit for quite a while. I've studied sort of games from a more mechanical perspective, and tried to understand sort of how people use and experience games. We just did a panel right before this on player experience in games. So that's definitely where I come to from these things. And when we talk about the question of games art, I decided I would focus on one particular aspect of it, and that is the metaphor. Without further ado, I'll get started. Now, what makes a game art? There was never going to be a complete, full answer to that question, and I certainly, even if there is, I certainly wouldn't find it here and now in 10 minutes. Really what I want to do is I want to just explore one component of what makes some games art, and how it generally, and the games that are generally considered art tend to have this certain one component. And I think that it should help to understand the lens through which we perceive and understand these games, and should understand that we don't have to necessarily take all the games we play directly at face value. I will make the disclaimer that I'm not an English major, I'm a computer science major, so you know, for those of you who have that background, this might come off as a little simplistic, but just roll with me. So, there are certain games that many people agree are probably art. Name a couple. Fez? Okay, got some interesting answers here. I heard some that are in common. I've got, how about Journey? Yeah. Braid, I definitely heard that mentioned. Passage, who knows Jason Rohrer? Yeah. Flower. Limbo. So those are the ones that came to my mind most immediately. Now, what do you think all these games have in common? Style. Here's a big hint. It was in my title. Metaphor. The metaphor. The metaphor is a staple of, you know, it's kind of been around for a while. It's the staple of many works of fine art, and you know, maybe just might be responsible for the beauty of life and the beauty of life and the beauty of art. If we could only describe things literally, think how limited we would be.
Someone could argue that the metaphor is responsible for a lot of the sublime, a lot of what we can understand, even if we can't directly understand it. And it forms this forms the basis for the endless academic pontification, and I think is the only thing keeping the English journal papers a lot afloat. But how can we really understand metaphors in games? It's interesting because the games that I showed there, they really play with the figurative. What are these games about? Want to offer some ideas? Okay, death. Cycles.
Perception.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So we're hearing some pretty big and heavy stuff here. That's really fascinating. I mean, these games on the surface of them are actually pretty literal with respect to what you're doing. You're walking, you're jumping, you're doing action things. Each one of these games, they have a scene that they're painting that you are literally interacting with. In fact, most of these are generally platforms. In the case of Braided Limbo, you are just jumping around and avoiding enemies. But we know that they mean something more. We know that there is something beneath the surface. But what is it exactly? They never really provide us with the answer to that question, and that can be frustrating to us as gamers because we are looking for answers. We are looking to solve puzzles and progress through things. And as a reward, we get
What? We get these vagaries. I mean,
the ending to Limbo is still kind of very much like, what the hell was that?
so it's a lot of this comes from being comfortable or becoming comfortable in gray areas and certain areas where games are not going to tell you what is below the surface. And that, of course, is where the metaphor comes in.
So let's talk about some games that are probably not designed as metaphors. Many of these games that you might recognize in the game room, we can expect to take these more or less at face value. Candy Crushing really is just about, crushing candies. And, in Sonic and Pokemon, they really are just about, they're usually, many of them are targeted either towards much younger gamers or for, the hardcore bro types like Halo, and so these games, we can take, many of these games, these AAA games, we can take them at face value. There's no real question as to what it is we're doing. We know that the world we're playing is the reality with respect to that game. Now, there are some games that actually have metaphors in their stories. That's actually very interesting. These are games that are usually very story-driven, and and as such are very well regarded as a result. And these games usually receive a lot of critical acclaim because of their writing, when they marry an effective gameplay, all the better. But the question I want to ask is, which of these games are metaphors, like the ones that we showed before? And what do you think, and with this idea in mind, of understanding games as they are literally being presented to us versus games that have a system we're seeing, but we can tell there's more behind it. So, I have some thoughts on a couple of games in which this might be true for. Now, someone mentioned Shadow of the Colossus before. I think an argument could be made that both Ico and Shadow of the Colossus can be metaphors in some sense. And there are a few reasons why. First of all, there's almost no dialogue. This is important, because the more we have dialogue, the more you would be grounded in that particular world. And this is something that's going to come up again. If there's too much detail, the metaphor doesn't work. And in these cases, you never have a clear sense of what the ultimate goal is, because there's not a lot of backstory or context given. I mean, you know what you have to do as the player, but you don't know what you are doing or why you're doing it as the character. And so, I mean, you play these games for the experience, but not really for an understanding of what you are meant exactly to be accomplishing. And talking about the world, these games, especially for their time, put a lot of detail into the scenery. You really got a sense of this lush world and what they were showing you. But it's quite possible that this world, actually stood in for something else. This clear visual imagery provides the opportunity for, very deep metaphor. And there are also not too many characters. So you can really understand this as one person's journey or one person's perspective, or whatever they see this as their own journey being. I don't claim to know what these games are intended to represent beyond the literal, but I think a strong case can be made that they do represent something. Now, to go in a completely different direction, who here knows about Octodad? Alright, so for those who know, it was an indie game, it was released a few years ago. You were a human octopus creature, and you have a wife and human children. So from the get-go, you can tell this is not meant to be realistic in the slightest. What's interesting about this game is that your challenge really is just getting around. Because you're an octopus creature, you really have a lot of control over how you move, and you're likely to knock into things and move things around. It's not on fighting, it's not even on exploration, it's just moving. And in the storyline, almost no one realizes you're an octopus. So you're kind of this, you're kind of this animal in a man's world. And I wondered, could that be a metaphor for the isolation and you can be a part of this family, you can be a part of the world, but you could still feel so alienated and different. The thing that sort of drove this home for me is that it reminds me of another classic story in which, an animal was thrust into a man's world. It didn't go so well. Octodad has a much happier ending than that, but if you guys remember 9th grade English, this is kind of what it reminded me of. And the last one that I just want to go through real quick is an exercise in the past. I hope you guys recognize this, but if we try and transport ourselves back to 1985, and we're looking at this for the first time, I think our reaction might be something closer to what that caption says. Because seriously, it's like nothing you would have seen before. I don't know if people really thought that this was meant to be realistic or literal when this first came out. And we've confirmed that Miyamoto borrowed a lot from Alice in Wonderland. Partially to change Mario's size. It's like, we should use the mushroom like Alice in Wonderland. This could be a metaphor for almost anything on its own. Any ideas?
Power fantasy of the common man. The power fantasy of the common man.
The power fantasy of the common man.
Oh, we'll take the obvious one. Drugs.
Drugs. Well, maybe not a metaphor for drugs, maybe a drug experience, yeah?
The feeling you get when you feel like you don't fit in.
Okay, metaphor for isolationism.
Did you know that he also was heavily influenced by the work of René Magritte, who is a surrealist painter, a Belgian surrealist painter that also played a lot with the notion of symbols and the meanings of symbols. So it's interesting how the game assigns like the mushroom to become an empowerment object and things like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the flower too, and so it's just really weird. Look at all this stuff. You've got these piranhas, you've got these turtles, you've got these clouds in the bushes looking exactly the same. What's going on here? Really, it was only after later games that this world became the reality, that these staples from these first games permeated every Mario game ever since. But on its own, when at the time, this was just really this could have meant anything. And there's even like an accompanying theory that Super Mario Brothers 3 is a play that you guys can ask me about later, but I won't get into it now. So, how did I do this? How might you be able to tell if a game is a metaphor, or could potentially be a metaphor? I'd say, for one, there's generally a minimalist feel. They try to do more with less. And there's little dialogue or backstory. The one exception I thought to this is Braid, in which it has an extensive backstory, but the entire thing is a metaphor. And few characters. So the general feel of the general philosophy that I have in sort of understanding games in this context is that if they don't become too detailed, then they may have a case for being a metaphor. Because once you start putting more detail in, the metaphor starts to lose its effectiveness. If I want to make a girl swoon, I might look into her eyes and tell them, they're a deep ocean. But if I start telling her, it's an ocean, deep in the middle of Atlantic at about 40,000 depths, pH level, it doesn't quite work anymore.
Yeah.
So there is an upper limit to how effective. So by that same token, games that become very detailed and put a lot of detail and commitment to the world that they're portraying to you are probably meant to be taken literally. But games that don't may in fact have a case for being a metaphor. And so I want to just end by saying that metaphor is not the be-all and end-all of art. And there's plenty of art that's not constructed as a metaphor, and probably a few games that are taken literally that could be considered art. I, for one, would love to see the Andy Warhol of game art, whatever that means. Not just like copying his style, I meant his attitudes toward art and commerce and how they blended together. But someone who had very much both in mind. I would really I guess the way that I would end is that art brings some level of depth and sophistication to how we see what's in front of us. And so that's just, if you take one thing away from this little mini talk, it's that to approach games with that sense, that you're not just accomplishing the goal you see in front of you, there might be something deeper going on, and there might be some greater experience you can take away from it. Thank you.
I just want to remark that this is really making me feel a lot about the game Monument Valley.
Yeah. Such a good game.
If you,
Oh, yeah. Sound.
While we're transferring over, I would like to say I've noticed a couple themes in the talk. Technology, limitations, placing limitations on yourself, and minimalism. And then I also like that we're talking about not only different kinds of art from different parts of game development, but also notions of art from different periods. Like, metaphor is perhaps very 20th century, but again, that going back to what I was talking about too, it's interesting because you do see that metamorphosis from this sort of like the very literal to the very metaphorical in a lot of games that are considered by many to be art games. There we go.
There we are. Okay. So, hi. My name's Tamara Yadao, and I am an interdisciplinary artist, musician, and composer. I'm a chiptune composer, and also one half of the game art duo Foci and Loci. We did a performance yesterday evening in this room, actually, if you were there. And my partner, Chris Burke, who is also the talk show game host for The Spartan Life, also made an appearance on Friday. We worked together to build sound machines and virtual instruments that trigger timed audio-visual events in game space. We're primarily right now using the video game Little Big Planet. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to show some clips, and it's interesting because I think, Chris, we were talking about some of those art history references that were coming up. There are some clips of some of those pieces in this, and we can, talk about that afterwards. I am going to show you that one too, but this is the one I wanted to open with. I think it sounds like we're running out of time, but so I'll just leave with that. And questions.
Yes, I'll take questions now.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, right front. So, I'm gonna put it back to you about Halo. Because you don't think there's a metaphor, but I think you're just not prepared to see metaphor in a game that's that core. And do you think that there's a dichotomy between this game is core, therefore it can't be art, whereas this game is art, therefore it can't be core?
I didn't say that.
Okay.
So I want to.
Well, okay, that's the further question is like, do you think that that's a problem?
No, I don't think it's a necessary dichotomy.
Yeah.
What I said was that games that are more detailed tend to not be metaphors for the reasons that I described. One person mentioned Chrono Trigger as art. I'm not sure if I agree with it, but I wouldn't shoot it down right away. And so, but I don't think, again, to go back to Andy Warhol, he talked very much about art and commerce. And there are plenty of artists from throughout the ages that have been able to make art that have been very popular and very recognized. So it's not mutually exclusive by any means.
So I want to point out two things. You have a Master Chief Andy Warhol shirt on,
Yes, I do. I
Which-
have
which-
a cheap
which-
Andy Warhol shirt on.
which makes that interaction that just happened that much fruitful. I do want to talk about like a game that is considered at one time to be the core of games, but I've seen an interesting metaphorical breakdown of it. It's called Burger Time. And this paper is written by a colleague of mine, Mike Trainer, and he did a quote-unquote proceduralist analysis of Burger Time, and in it, he didn't do it through any kind of lens. It was just like, what is the metaphor of Burger Time, or what is Burger Time about? So, he said, cooking, you're a chef, you have to make burgers, okay? So if you're cooking and you're a chef and you're trying to make burgers, what the heck is up with all those hot dogs and pickles trying to kill you? And he determined that based on the limitations and style of games that were out there at the time, notably platformers, it's a competition. The enemies are a metaphor for perhaps your competition. So it's hard to make an economic game about restaurants competing, but it is easy to make a platformer where you have to assemble burgers, and the local hot dog stand is perhaps an enemy trying to kill you. So chew on that one, everybody. Yes.
I feel like there's a difference between the game itself is the metaphor, and the story the game is telling has metaphors in it, or
Yeah.
can be sort of metaphor itself. And the more minimalist the experience, the more likely it is that the game itself is the metaphor. Whereas Halo has a fairly developed story, and lots of details. And the rating of the Halo is its own metaphor. But
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess the question about mechanics versus story, where is the metaphor contained?
Uh-oh, we're about to go proceduralist versus ludologist. Well, no, and some people would argue that, yeah, in a minimalist game, that is the art of the game design, is that the game story is enacted by the player and thus becomes metaphor. And then, if we take a much smaller game like Dysphoria, one of my favorite examples of hoity-toity games out there, that sounds judgmental. I love this game. So it has a message, and for that, it is somebody's meaningful art. But it has a message, and some people would be like, well, that's not a game because it has a set answer. But, again, then you get into the as existential, like what is art and blah, blah, blah. But yeah, you could consider that perhaps an artful game.
I also try not to break down games into different components and start to say this is this and that is that. I try and take them as holistic experiences. Yeah, in the back.
Yeah, so I think an interesting point there, because I think one of the trouble with games is that it's goal-driven. It has to be goal-driven in order for it to be a game, right?
Mhm.
So that gets in the way of art. With art, you typically have a message, so you want them to get that message, so you have all these other competing things that are getting in the way.
Do you have a message in art necessarily?
And again, I think that's interesting to me because, again, going into the history of art, I think it's only within the last century that we looked at art with a message. But even then, if you look at the art as a message, and this is what I'm trying to break down with the Atelier games, if you look at if it's studying under masters, I can look at Liszewski's work and say, well, what was he doing with his message, and how can that turn into a game? Now, Liszewski, he's doing two things. One, he made propaganda posters, and that helped me. So there's a violence in it, and thus I was like, well, what's this one prominent one like? Oh, it's kind of like Yara's Revenge, so there we go. And then suprematism is about art for art's sake, so it was just like a black square. And, you know, because somebody, he didn't do it, but somebody else did it, just a black square. And it was like, it's art. Meaning what? It's art. Go away.
This is not a pipe.
Huh?
This is not a pipe.
Yeah, this is not a pipe, yeah. That's another one I want to do. But the idea being that, okay, so I'm going to, for this one, make a very game-like game because it's game for game's sake. But something else, I might make a game that has goals. So goals are how you get the player to interact with that message. And thus, I always like to say, you know, if you watch a film with a message, you might sympathize because it's passive, but if you play a game with a message and it's interactive and you interact with the message or the meaning, then you empathize.
I just wanted to ask Tamara a quick question here. When you design foci and loci environments, do you ever imagine that you might drew one with, like, say, I know the one that you showed at the end with the show for Paris Magritte Works last year was goal-driven, even if the goal was just to look at all of the different paintings. Do you see that as kind of like diametrically opposed to what foci and loci is about?
No, actually. I think, you know, we sort of play around with the idea of game mechanics, but of course it's very experimental. So sometimes it's just the result of what we make based on our imagination, and then in other ways it's sometimes a little more specified, like wander this brick wall and figure out how to navigate it such that you can break apart this little piece of brick to see what you're going to see. That is, it's interesting because we never really finished this conversation on email, Chris, but we call that one, the first working title was actually called This Is Not a Game, you know? So in the sense that people would approach it with a different sense of perception, which is what kind of Magritte was about in a way, the perception of time and space. But it's called The Treachery of Z. Yeah. Which is the original, some of those original works were part of that notion of called treachery of images. So we do very much look to, for inspiration from the modernist period in particular because people were innovating with the forms. And so I really do embrace the, you know, the fact that this is a video game. Yeah. We love that about it, but we also love the fact that virtual space is so plastic, the plasticity of it, that it can be manipulated in this really interesting way in both an audio and visual sense. So,
are there any questions? So how many of you out there, one more, how many of you out there are game artists? Okay, a couple people. So what do you use? What do you do?
3D modeling with Maya.
3D modeling with Maya, okay. Did you study any art beforehand? Yeah.
I doodled in sketchbooks in high school.
Okay, doodled and sketched, so did I.
I did go to summer camps and learn a lot as far as college.
Okay. What about you? Yes.
Well, I use programming as art.
Programming is art. Ooh, I like that. Yeah, programming is art, and I work with a guy who does procedural art generation, and it is quite beautiful. And there's something kind of wild to it. Turning math equations into visual components, and then I had a professor in college that then 3D printed these Rhino models that he derived from mathematical equations. So, yeah, I think. Yeah, one more question. Anybody? No? Bueller? Yeah.
So, for everyone involved, because games are such interactive things, do you think the best description of art in games as a general thing would be the interaction between all of the elements? Because maybe you have really great concept art, but then it's like the gameplay doesn't drive you to think in that direction.
So the question was, So the question was, do we think that the art in the game is the interaction? And I find that to be a very interesting question because, well, first of all, yes, I think that. But I think as it applies to like the is game art portion of it, I think to me, in academic game circles or game study circles or even in the regular game industry, I feel like when people make art games, they make games about the mechanics as the art. And I think the processes of the game making, like the game sound, have become sort of lost and become very, I teach game art and design, so you know, you'll have the student that's like, well, but my poly count's right, but it's like, but your anatomy sucks, you know, on your character, or you have no sense of scale, that door is way too big or small. And it becomes like you lose not only art fundamentals, but the processes that make games, and I think this is just because we've just established the field, but the processes of making games, I think, we need to start studying in addition to the design of the holistic object itself.
No, I just want to add, that's a really great point, because yeah, when I talk to, you know, other colleagues in game audio or game audio students, and, you know, they immediately think of audio as just assets, and they're like, but, you know, I went out and I did a great job in, like, creating this asset. And I'm like, again, yes, it sounds fantastic, but have you thought deeper? Have you thought deeper about the meaning of what's going on? Like, what about thinking about that sound as this incredible storytelling and design device? And they look at me and go, sound can like tell stories? And I'm like, okay, we gotta step back and talk more.
All right, I think we're closing up here, but we will stick around in case we would love to come talk with us more. Thank you.
Thank you.